right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Alta Live. I am so happy to see you are all here joining today's discussion on California's rural pregnancies and the decisions faced by pregnant Californians who live far enough from labor and delivery departments that they've got to plan for multiple birth possibilities and not necessarily desirable ones. For example, having birth on the side of the road. We are joined today by writer, Alta contributor, and relatively new parent, Kailyn McCord, who wrote about her experience giving birth in rural Mendocino County for Alta's Weekend Read newsletter. Kailyn McCord writes on the north coast of California with recent support from UCross Foundation and the Bread Loaf Writers Conference. You can find her work in numerous places, including Literary Hub, Plowshares, the Master's Review, and Alta Journal. When she's not writing, she loves being outdoors, as is evidenced by her background today. Before I dive in, some brief housekeeping. Alta Live is the digital interview series we do here at Alta Journal. If you're unfamiliar with Alta, we are an award-winning quarterly magazine focused on California and the West. We've got a website. We've got a really robust California book club. In fact, tomorrow night, we're welcoming Dave Eggers to talk about his book, The Every. That California Book Club's free to everyone. So is Alta Live every Wednesday at 12:30. We expand upon an article from the magazine, from our website, from our newsletters, with either the subject matter, one of our authors, a writer, an artist sometimes. It's really cool. So if you like what we do here, I hope you'll consider joining us as a member. $50 a year or $3 a month gets you kind of a variety of accesses. Don't worry, I'm going to send you a link to subscribe. I also want to invite anyone who might be near Orange County on Saturday afternoon, head over to Alta Baja Market. We're doing a Baja wine tasting in celebration of our Baja issue. That's at 3 o'clock at Alta Baja Market in Santa Ana, California, with readings from Bill Esparza, Gustavo Ariana, and then wine tasting with some Baja winemakers. So you're all invited to that as well. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen to ask questions for our guest. We're going to chat for about 30 minutes and get to as many of your questions as we can. This interview is being recorded and will be posted to altaonline.com later today. We'll send you an email with a link to that, a link to Kailyn's article in Alta Online, as well as where you can find her work, follow her on social, and invitations to upcoming events. So with that, it is so nice to see where our community is zooming in from today. Hi, Oakland. I am in Novato, California. Kailyn, where are you?
I'm just outside of Fort Bragg, on the coast, on the north coast. I'm outside. It's a real trees, not Zoom trees, which is
I
great.
at first thought it was your fake Zoom background, but no,
It's
you are
not, it's
literally
real.
hi, Portland, Oregon. I want to start with, for those that haven't had a chance yet to read your latest for Alta. This is your third for us. Thank you very
It
much.
is. Yeah.
Can you just kind of give us a background, a brief history of the relatively present day birthing options that used to exist on the Mendocino coast when the mill was active, when there was kind of a big family population happening there? What happened and what kind of the situation is now in terms of a birthing center?
Yeah. So the background out here is for a long time, it was, a very unpopulated rural area where births were basically handled by families from, the turn of the century on. In the 50s, 60s, we had some general practitioners doing births. And then in 1973, an obstetrician moved here, started a practice with a couple of other OBs, and then immediately hired, because of the demand of the kind of hippie populations that ended up here in a back to land movement. They started, they really incorporated midwives into their practice. They hired, I believe, one of the first graduating classes of midwives in California. And then their practice encouraged sort of like natural birth and home birth because that's what the population here was demanding, but they had a full obstetrical backup. So that practice was called Caring for Women. And I'm working on a book about this, so it's like forefront of my mind. And for a while, out here through sort of the the late 80s, and then again in another iteration through the early 2000s, we had a full obstetric staff. We had a local county hospital where you could give birth basically in any way you wanted, whether that was, quote unquote natural or like physiologic birth with no pain medication, or you wanted pain medication, or you needed a cesarean. All of those options were available out here. Or this is the really sort of, I think, the singular part is that you could birth at home with a fully trained midwife who would be the same midwife who would come with you to the hospital. So we had an integrated healthcare system out here with continuity of care that was really amazing. Part of that was supported by a lot of young families here for the logging industry. Part of it was also supported by the fact that those jobs came with private insurance reimbursements. So flash forward through a few iterations that are kind of detailed, I won't get into, but in 2005, the midwives stopped working for the hospital. A lot of the original OBs retired. They hired a new OB. And because of that, and also a combination of the mill closing in 2002, the hospital had to start working with only Medicaid reimbursements. So it was a lot more difficult to stay afloat financially. After emergency services, obstetrics is the most expensive department in a hospital to keep open because you need highly trained, specialized staff on call 24/7. And so it was partly that women on the coast started having fewer babies. There were other factors, though. A lot of people name that factor as the thing that closed. And then in 2012, our local hospital declared bankruptcy for the first time, and sort of OB started to come into question. And then in 2019, it was its last year in operation. So that also meant that all of the sort of home birth practicing midwives, and there are a lot of them out here, were sort of a more alternative part of California, and a lot of people like to give birth at home with midwife. And those midwives no longer had local backup. So this has actually changed as of like 6 months ago, but up until then, we had no midwives on the coast who were willing to do a birth, and no OB unit and no labor and delivery at all. So every woman out here, unless you wanted to do a free birth, which is where you birth with no attendance, you drive over the hill, depending on where you are on the coast. It's between an hour and a half and 2 hours to Ukiah for all your prenatal, for labor and delivery, for everything.
So I have so many questions about this. First of all, you I, I feel like anyone who's given birth is like, it's such a, we were talking about this before we started. It's such kind of
Mhm.
a personal process and how much control you have in it. You really wanted, well, first of all, you've chosen to kind of live out here. You're an Oakland native.
Yes,
You and your partner moved from Oakland
yes.
because you wanted kind of this rural experience.
Yeah.
So, I mean, in terms of kind of options, did you know what you were getting into when you wanted to have a child and
I knew that we had very scant labor and delivery support. And I should correct myself. You can do some prenatal out here on the coast, but you have to switch for delivery and late in your pregnancy. I didn't realize how much that would sort of freak me out until I got pregnant. And then I went through this really amazing kind of transformation about birth that I really credit to the women in this community, where I was no longer scared of the fact that I was far from care, because I really feel like I came to a place where I understood birth differently. I wasn't scared of birth. And that was a huge shift for me. But yeah, we have chosen to live rurally. It's different. We had, the power was out for like 5 days a couple weeks ago. And when you don't have power and you're on a well, you also don't have water. Like there's stuff that happens out here. But it's, to me, the sensibility around birth that has come from living rurally is really valuable. And I feel really, this is going to sound crazy, but like very lucky that I got to give birth how I got to give birth.
one of the options that you had to consider and your article kind of starts off with this is
Mhm.
there is this, as you mentioned, you know, 2 hour drive to a
Mhm.
labor and delivery, a hospital that provides labor and delivery. Technically, there is an ER closer to you.
Yeah,
I mean, but
there are
you could
two. Yeah, but the ER has what an ambulance has. It's not. Yes. Yeah.
right. But to give birth in a traditional hospital, it's
Mhm.
2 hours.
Yeah.
A big chunk of that has no cell service.
Yeah.
And one of the things you had to plan for was giving birth on the side of the road.
I mean, yeah, we talked about it. Like I think part of what maybe goes away a little bit when you kind of take the fear narrative off of birth is that you get to look in a pretty clear-eyed way about what might happen practically. And like in retrospect, like in no way were we prepared for that. I'm very glad that that didn't happen. Um, but I did for this article, I did talk to a couple of different Fort Bragg families who have had their kids on Highway 20. And it's interesting. I also talked to our local ER physician, Robin Saran, who's a really fascinating man. And he was one of the people who voted to close labor and delivery out here. And part of his vote for that, which has been a tough thing for him to navigate in our community, part of his vote for that came from a lot of research that he did about what happens when rural hospitals close and travel in birth gets farther. And the results are pretty fascinating. From what he was able to find in these studies, precipitous birth and like highway birth and or home birth gets more frequent and more common. But the outcomes for moms and babies don't get worse. So you don't have higher neonatal mortality, you don't have higher maternal mortality morbidity. Instead, those births that happen sort of quickly are typically speaking births that are like all systems go kind of. They're sort of like all systems are functioning pretty well. And so they can, they're not ideal, but like usually that's not where you see baby's heart rate doing scary things.
Right.
Usually it's not where you see big hemorrhages. Usually, like those things don't necessarily go hand in hand. Not always, of course, there's no ultimates in birth, but
I want to get into the community in the North Coast and the kind of midwife, doula, home birth, or community. But first, can you talk a little bit about what other California rural communities are experiencing in terms of access to labor and delivery?
yeah. So I know there's a really wonderful CalWorks article that came out about this recently. In the last 6 years, I think the number is 19 maternity wards have closed across the state of California, partly because of that stat of it's just one of the most expensive departments to keep open. But a disproportionate number of those have been located rurally. So like women are doing all kinds of different things. I know that out here on the coast, and I won't speak to other rural areas, like we do now have a home birth midwife who's from rural Oregon, and she's willing to do births on the coast with no obstetric backup. And women are doing that. In fact, a lot of women that I know in my mom's group gave birth here in the last 6 months. And that's the choice that you have. If we ever have a second kid, that'll be a choice that Ben and I talk about, because I was quote unquote fast for a first time mom. So the options that you start to weigh if you think you're going to have a fast labor for whatever reason are really, do I want to do this potentially on a highway, or do I want to risk doing it at home where providers can come to me? And it's tricky. But yeah, maternity wards are closing, and that
Why?
my understanding is expense. And then also because there's general trends in healthcare where we're centralizing in sort of like big conglomerate hospitals in urban areas. So women are just traveling farther. That's what we're
Yeah.
doing. It's partly, a result of sort of capitalism in healthcare,
Right.
and partly just urban population centers.
So in terms of the North Coast,
Yeah.
kind of coastal Mendocino, what is you mentioned your mom's group, and we were chatting earlier. You did a ton of research
Mhm.
while you were trying to get pregnant, and then once you found out that you were pregnant,
Yeah.
which kind of gave you a sense of what seems to me like confidence. You were
Yeah.
in your article, you were really saying what you wanted to do. You were making
Yeah.
your own decisions. You weren't turning
I,
everything over to an expert.
yeah. Well, I think that's, so I'll credit basically the sort of any mom over 50 on the Mendocino coast who I talked to, of which, dozens and dozens when I was trying to get pregnant and after I was pregnant, who basically said like, of course I gave birth at home, and like, of course that's what you do. And of course, like there's a different culture out here with a different attitude towards birth. Um, and I think that's really part of it, is encountering that over and over again and realizing that it can be real, and that birth as something that can be not only can be yours, but like sort of I felt like it should be mine. Was I felt that really deeply. And then the other thing that I think is to thank for that is basically educating myself about the midwifery model of care, which says, yes, it's good to have providers who will help you if something goes wrong, but largely the work of birth is yours to do. And my midwives, specifically Heidi and Adri, if they are watching, are incredible women. And I feel like I could, I felt like I could arrive at the birth center, that I would be supported in whatever it is that I wanted to do, whether it be walk around the block or scream or not scream or, you know, eat a piece of cake. Any of that was available to me in birth, but that if something was going to go wrong, these women were experts and they could either help me themselves, or we could get somewhere that if I needed additional support, that could happen.
How did you tap into that community?
I mean, it's kind of hard not to out here.
Really?
Um, yeah, it's I think the line from a doula friend of mine who I know, she grew up in Mendocino, was like half of all of the women used to birth at home out here. Like it's pretty ubiquitous as a value system. And then I think a big part of it was that instead of home birth midwives on the coast now, a lot of women will give birth at this place called Bloom Water Birth and Wellness Center, which is an independent freestanding birth center that's about 4 blocks from the hospital in Ukiah. And so I knew Bloom existed, and going to Bloom, it's actually wonderful. They have this whole library when you walk in the door of all of these books, Ina May Gaskin's books, different sort of books on hypnobirthing, all of that kind of theoretical world of birth. And I read a lot. I like information.
To give birth at Bloom, you
Mhm,
still need to get to Ukiah.
mhm. You do.
What?
Yeah.
So that's a trek. What
Yeah.
do what is the prenatal and postnatal experience like on the coast?
So you can do prenatal care out here with Mendocino Coast clinics, and then you can transfer to the hospital. You can transfer that care to the hospital in Ukiah, which is run by Adventist. You can also, there are a couple providers out here. One of them is, she's my GP, and she's a former home birth midwife who then became a nurse practitioner. um, and she will do prenatal care up until I think it's 36 weeks or 30
Oh,
weeks, and then you transfer to Ukiah. The reason why, and this was a huge part of our choice that we didn't want to do that, is because I wanted continuity of care. So I wanted to see the same people for all of my prenatal, for delivery, and for postnatal, because I knew for me that that provider relationship was going to be key to my experience of birth. Um, so I went over the hill and back for every single prenatal visit, except for like a couple where the midwives were out on the coast anyway, like visiting families. And that's the other cool thing, is that when you give birth at Bloom, like they come to you for the first couple prenatal, postnatal visits. So like you don't have to leave your house, which is really wonderful when you have a brand new baby and you've just given birth. But it was a ton of travel. Like I think, especially because I went so late, I went like almost all the way up to 42 weeks, and we were going over the hill like every other day at the very end, and I was almost 10 months pregnant, like very uncomfortable. Hours and hours of your day every day. I mean, it's a real trek. Yeah.
I'm so inspired by how confident you were in kind of advocating for yourself, and not even but just saying like, this is what I'm going to do and this is what I want to do. I turned it over. I was like, I don't have an MD. What to do, and drug me
Well,
up. But I didn't know that I don't think I would
right,
consider other options. I mean, everyone's different,
right,
but I didn't have any sense that I was in charge of it.
right. I mean, I think this is part of why I want to write the book that I want to write, is because I feel like there's a narrative now in sort of American birthing culture that is that like women aren't, and this is not a knock on anyone who has given birth in a way that is not the way I give birth. I think, and this comes through in the article, I hope, like part of what Mendocino Coast used to have is choices, right, for women. And one of the stories that actually couldn't stay in because of length was about my friend Heidi, who's a town council woman here, and like she gave birth. She had 2 C-sections. She had a breech. Her baby was breech. She had a first C-section, and like the whole town. And she was born. Her babies were born in the same room that she was born in, and like her father was a pediatrician who then oversaw her C. Like it was like a whole like a community affair. Her birth was a community affair, and it was a cesarean. Like it's about choosing the kind of birth you feel comfortable choosing. Um, but women even feeling like they can do that, I think is really absent from the American birth narrative right now. And I think I want to tell the story of the Mendocino Coast and births here, because we used to have such an incredible array of choices. And the OBs who came here, in the 70s, were the first obstetricians. We were officially the first family-centered maternity ward in the country, and they were the first OBs to have fathers in the delivery room.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
Yeah, and then after that, they did this whole program where they would, if parents wanted, they could have older siblings come too. There's really amazing photographs of births from back then with these little kids in scrubs, like watching their siblings come into the world. Um, so yeah, I think, I think part of rural living sort of demands of you a self-awareness and an agency that I'm not always sure. For me, I wouldn't have clicked into in another way. And I took that into birth. And it's also just, it's an institutional memory thing, institutional, generational memory. Like, because there are women here who have done it, I felt like I could do it. And it helps that we have like excellent midwives. Like the midwives out here are very great.
What is your ideal vision for kind of labor and delivery options?
Ugh.
What's your
If
dream
I had a
world?
million, yeah, if I had $1 million or,
Yeah,
$100 million,
$20 million.
yeah,
Whatever it costs. Yeah.
um, I would hope that every birthing woman would have access to the kind of care that she wants, and that care could be continuous through a sort of spectrum of however her prenatal and birth went. So like if I was going to imagine it for the coast, I would have an obstetric backup staff who worked closely with midwives. Everyone would be well paid. um, and I think, at least for me, it meant a lot to know my providers, like to really know them and know they were a part of my community, which I think is something else that I wouldn't have had if I was giving birth in a city. Living rurally is very personal. The people you interact with at the grocery store are the same people you interact with, when they're coming to like hang out with you at your barbecue. Like you're yourself everywhere you go. Um, and so I think I would want women to be able to connect personally with their care providers. But yeah, I think maybe sometimes obstetrics and midwifery kind of do this in the current birthing world, or home birth and hospital birth do this. And I don't think they have to. I think that if we could recognize the practitioners that like uh, birth is kind of, it takes some turns, but we can all work together in it. I think that would be my dream. And I'd start a birth center here. I'd hire, my best obstetrician friends, of which I have a few, and I'd pay them lots of money, and I'd hire the midwives in Ukiah to live here, and that's what I do.
Sounds great. So that's a movie.
Yeah.
All right, let's dive into some questions. Kevin asks, Kevin, there are no such thing as dumb questions. This was one of mine as well.
Okay.
What happens if a woman giving birth at home ends up needing a C-section? Would that be a life flight type situation?
Great question. So I will start with saying that I'm not a midwife and not an expert, but having read a lot about this, um, scenarios like that are pretty rare in terms of being a quote unquote like time sensitive emergency. Like most of the time, if cesarean ends up being a resource that a woman needs, you have a lot of clues leading up to that for a lot of hours in birth. And then the second thing that I would say is that unfortunately, a helicopter won't take a laboring woman, pretty much full stop, because there's not enough space to maneuver in the helicopter, nor are there enough personnel in the helicopter when one patient becomes two patients, which you have to consider a birthing woman two patients. Because if the baby comes, then you have two patients. So that was something I learned from Davey Beek, who's our EMT supervisor out here. And he's the one who transports women to Ukiah. Home birth can start at home and can transfer and can absolutely need a cesarean. One of the reasons why I chose to birth at Bloom and not to birth at home is that I wanted to be closer to a hospital in the event that something happened. So, I'm not saying that like I'm, mountain woman and like I'm gonna give birth out here, no problem. A lot of people do make that choice, and I think that can be the right choice for them. But
Yeah, I mean that Kevin, I'm right there with you. That was one of mine too.
yeah,
Um, can you tell us more about the book we two questions, more about the book you're writing?
yes, thanks, Pete. Um, yeah, so I'm working on this book about the history of labor and delivery out here. It focuses on those obstetricians and midwives, and then the transition that happened, um, sort of as care started to fall apart. It looks a lot at how capitalism interfaces with birth in a rural setting, but it also, I hope there's an underpinning theme of sort of uh, really what rural care can look like when it's at its best. And I sound like a zealot, but I really believe that we had a, a birthing world out here that was unrivaled in the country. in terms of care for women. And I don't think anybody really knows that. So I want to tell them about it. Um,
You want to tell them about it in the hopes that it can
in the hopes
happen.
that people can know that um, that you don't have to sort of choose the safety of a hospital versus the risk of home birth. Like that's not, those things are not at war. No one is at war. It's his birth. It's not a war. And that, I think that given, and there are hospitals that are doing more integrated systems like this, like UCSF is one of them. There are midwives that operate in hospitals now. It was not common in the 70s. But I think that a lot of women just aren't, they're not super aware of like the history of birth, how sort of very, very common sort of run of the mill birth practices that exist now, um, I would argue aren't that supported by science. Like if you look at induction or you look at Pitocin usage or you look at, those kinds of common interventions, that they're, that 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 when you look at a community like what we had out here and sort of a care practice like what we had out here, they're like virtually unnecessary. I would argue. Um, yeah.
Would you, oh wow, this is Pancho asks, would you have been disappointed if you hadn't um mentioned the connection between birth and capitalism? What? I don't get it.
He's saying he would have been disappointed if you hadn't mentioned
Oh,
it.
oh,
And
would have been
I'll
disappointed.
say amen to that. Yeah. And I think that's also part of what I want to talk about because, on the coast, we went from a really holistic, gentle birth centered obstetric practice with home birth midwives who were also had hospital privileges. I mean, we had birthing beds made by local craftsmen out of milled madrone wood. Like they were in the hospital. And we now have a Christian for-profit conglomerate that, only can barely staff our ER. Like that's sort of where,
Right.
so under the auspices of this, supposedly very small story, I think there's a lot of huge, huge trends that we're seeing in healthcare, in general, not just maternity care. But birth is one of those moments, I think, for everyone that is just, it should be sweet and transformative and powerful. And I mean, I'll get emotional about it, but like I've never had a more spectacular day in my life. And that should be um, magical. It should be supported. And even if you end up, in a hospital having a cesarean, if you have providers who believe in your care and you know them and they're integrated in the system, you can still feel positive about that. There's a ton of research that shows women feel positive about their births when they feel like they could make the choices they wanted to make. And I think that we had that once here. So I want to tell about it.
I don't want to, before we let you get back to your life and get you off of your laptop and into nature and
And
mothering and
back to my
writing.
daughter. Yeah,
Yes.
that's the rest of my day is nursing and baby. Yeah.
I'm curious, you mentioned at the end, and I don't want to get too personal, but if you um choose to have another child one
Yeah.
day, would you do anything differently than the choices you made with, did you learn anything or in retrospect, would you have made different choices?
I think I will give myself more slack in the final weeks of pregnancy madness to just be pregnant. I think it's very hard to go very late past your due date, and I was a wreck. So I think finding more grace for myself in those weeks. And yeah, we might have a home birth. I've thought about it. I think I need to do more reading. I think I need to read more about one of the things that happened to me during my birth is that at the sort of, I didn't end up hemorrhaging or needing assistance. And midwives, actually, I should say, are like incredibly trained professionals to handle a postpartum hemorrhage. But I did have a few, Joan's cord was really short. It was like a foot and a half long. So she sort of pulled her placenta out a little as she came out, which meant that I bled a little more than they wanted to. And like researching scenarios like that, to think about whether I'd be comfortable with a home birth because a friend of mine named Yael gave me some advice when I was going into birth. First thing she said was be comfortable where you're laboring. All other decisions come after that. So I think in order to be comfortable where I was laboring, if we were going to give birth at home, I need to read a lot more about potential complications. But I loved my midwives. I think they would probably maybe consider coming to me instead of me coming to them. But I don't know. And if not, there is a home birth midwife who attends out here now. Um, and yeah, I'm not sure. It also depends on how old I am because I'm 36 now. And if it's many years down the line, I might look at my risks a little differently.
Yeah.
It depends. but I'd give birth at Bloom again in a heartbeat. No, wouldn't change it for the world. Not, no, absolutely not. And definitely, I will say that the best decision that I made, the one that I'm happiest that I made, is that I didn't have any pain relief. I loved being able to feel my body. That was really important.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well,
I know that's controversial.
you're a badass. Um, Thank you, Kailyn McCord. Thank you so much for this incredible piece for Alta, and your continued work for Alta, and of course for taking the time to join us today. Folks, before you leave, I would like to thank you all for coming and invite you next week. We welcome author India Mandelkern for a talk on her new book about the beauty and bureaucracy of the streetlights of Los Angeles. She has this really cool new book about just kind of the whole history of LA street lighting, public street lighting. And so she will be in conversation with David L. Eulin about that. That's a week from today at 12:30. Again, Kailyn McCord, thank you so much for joining us. Folks, thank you as well. Take care, and our best to Joan.
I'll send it along. Thank you so much, Beth.
Bye.